very unusual that you get a cabinet minister responding in this way, having seen many resignations over the years. Mostly they go quietly. They sort of, calm down, put their head under the pillow and hope that they'll get some kind of redemption later on and a restoration back to cabinet. I think he's taken the opposite view of this, which is that he wants to go out with a bang. He's talking to absolutely everybody. I've had a conversation with him myself in the last 24 hours. And I think he genuinely feels aggrieved by the situation. He feels that the report was almost a kind of technicality because the definition of bullying, he insists, was a pretty low bar in that one of the things that the definition took into account was that you didn't have to have intent. So one of the things that he seems to be particularly aggrieved about is this notion that, anything could be construed as bullying if it hurts somebody's feelings. So I think he feels that he's been done wrong, I guess, that he's had to resign because he said if they upheld any kind of complaint of bullying, he'd resigned. And I sort of think that he thinks he's resigned on a kind of technicality, really.
But he did say he'd resign if it happened, and then it happened. I mean, he's not the first. Even if it is true that it is unreasonable that he has been forced to resign, he's not the first person who's been unreasonably forced to resign. As you say, why doesn't he just keep his head down and go, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll do better next time," and come back in 6 months like everybody else does?
Well, I think it'd be pretty difficult to come back given the allegations that have been made. And don't forget that although the report covered numerous of the allegations, there was much wider briefing in the media about the kind of behaviour that he'd sort of exhibited. And, people talking about being sort of contemplating suicide, throwing up before meetings, all of that kind of thing. It's quite difficult, I think, in this day and age to have been sort of labelled a bully and to then come back. So I guess in some ways he feels that this is one and only opportunity to redeem himself for whatever he goes on to do next, whether that's continuing in government or whether he leaves government and does something in the private sector.
Do you think so? His warnings about how this will change the culture of government because ministers will be afraid to speak their mind to civil servants when civil servants are underperforming, and ministers won't be able to drive through their policies because they'll be afraid of offending people and so on. Does that hold any water, do you think?
I think it does to a certain extent. I think if you look into what he has been saying, the notion of bullying being something which isn't necessarily done with intent. So it's not somebody that's trying to sort of set out to ruin your life or to undermine you, but can be somebody that speaks abrasively, for example. And one of the things he said to me very clearly is some of the examples that were given in that report of him saying something was woeful or, the department was obstructive weren't things that were kind of pointed at individuals. They were things that he was commenting on more broadly. So he wasn't kind of saying, Joe Bloggs over there is a disgrace, or, Madam over there was disgusting or something like that. It was very much kind of, what he was commenting on a policy process or whatever, which I think he struggles to see as being abject bullying, basically. And I think if that terms of reference, I suppose now, for the word bullying is going to be adopted wholesale, it does raise certain questions for other cabinet ministers. I'm sure there are others that behave similarly, that are, very demanding of their workforce, etc., etc. I think Dominic Raab has a particular problem in that I think he probably lacks a kind of more human approach to some of his officials. And I think that that's probably been construed negatively against him, whereas I think some other cabinet ministers would have a bit more sort of charm about the way in which they conduct their business. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, it could create difficulties for others.
And look, conversely, before we move on from this, do you think this will prompt some changes in terms of just how the structures work, how easy it is to make a complaint about a minister if you're a civil servant, and how those complaints are processed and function? Because a lot of the problem seems to be here that civil servants felt they had a sort of a management issue, and they couldn't really do anything about it, right?
Yeah, and I think you saw in the letter that Rishi Sunak wrote in response to Dominic Raab's resignation letter that they do feel that there were some shortcomings in the process. The fact that as Dom has said publicly, he was not made aware of some of these complaints for many years, in some cases long after he'd left the department. And also the fact that some of the complaints were very, very historic. In most organisations and HR processes, complaints of this nature wouldn't be considered if they were outside a kind of 3-month period, largely because, you haven't got the kind of immediate evidence before you to be able to make a judgment on it, and potentially people have moved on, etc., etc. So I think there is a kind of suggestion that it wasn't handled in the most professional way it could be. And yes, I think we will expect that there will be some tweaking of the HR processes.
Okay, moving on. So the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, he says he's pursuing legal action over the lawfulness of the upcoming strike by NHS nurses in England following a request from hospital bosses. He's challenging the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing's right to stage a 48-hour walkout on the May bank holiday. It's basically saying that their mandate to strike has run out. What's going on here?
So my understanding is that when you ballot for strike action, you've got a sort of 6-month period during which you can carry that out. That is due to cease at the beginning of May. So I think this 2-day strike, one day would be lawful because it's in April, and one day would be unlawful because it's in May. So effectively, he is seeking a judicial ruling to say that actually this strike action is unlawful. I mean, presumably they can just reballot all over again, which will presumably be what they do next. But it does kind of mark a kind of escalation in these hostilities. I mean, there was a feeling some time ago that we were kind of getting there and that they were going to reach an agreement. Of course, the settlement that was proposed was put to RCN members and rejected. So I think that there is a sense that we're kind of at stalemate. But at the same time, the government is getting increasingly concerned about the situation, partly because obviously operations are being cancelled. We already have a massive NHS backlog. It's not that far away to the next general election. There needs to be some action on this. And this is going to make it more difficult for those deliverables for the government so that they can say by the time we get to an election, whether that's spring next year or not, that they've actually responded to the NHS crisis. So I think there is a kind of element of desperation sort of seeping in here. And I mean, I'm not sure that this is actually going to make any tangible difference, but I think it is a sign that the government are increasingly kind of desperate to solve this.
Although on the technicalities of it, it sounds a bit like he's got a point. Although I suppose the court will answer that question. Look, moving on. There's an excerpt from Anthony Seldon's new book on Boris Johnson in the Times magazine today, and then there'll be one in the Sunday Times tomorrow. Dominic Cummings features heavily. It's all very febrile, should we say? It's all very colourful, everything that was going on in Downing Street during Boris Johnson's reign. What did you find most interesting? What have we learnt, though?
I think what we've learned is just how biddable the Prime Minister was. I mean, it's not something necessarily that we didn't know at the time, but it's just painted in kind of technicolor, really, which was that he was being, it was a kind of real conflict for him between having somebody that he trusted to do his kind of, to help him shape the kind of government that he wanted, to do some of the dirty work of the government. And yet at the same time, he felt threatened by Dominic Cummings and he didn't want him to have as much power as he did. And I think you get a real sense of that kind of internal tussle that's going on within Boris Johnson about, both wanting to have somebody that's capable and, bright and able to do things, and at the same time feeling incredibly undermined by that. This whole notion of him kind of storming around saying, I'm the king, I'm the Führer.
Yes.
Which is interesting because it's something we knew as journalists, or certainly had been suggested, but was always vehemently denied by Number 10 that was indeed the case. But also the relationship with his wife, Carrie Johnson. I mean, she, again, not something that we didn't necessarily know, but again painted in really colourful terms just how influential she was in the government, and her role in it was not just as a bystander but very much as a participant. I
mean, in a way there's something quite pleasing in the way that the rumours that everyone of going around about the dynamics sort of turn out to pretty much be true if this is to be believed. Look, very finally, before I let you go, and briefly as well, the SNP have had quite a week, further arrests and so on. Do you have any sense of where this is heading?
Gosh, I wish I did. I mean, it's a massive story, and I think it's still got a way to run. Basically, I mean, everybody's expecting that there'll be more arrests.
Yeah, more camper vans, even
more camper vans. Yeah. The future of Nicola Sturgeon is obviously a fascinating question, given how prominent a role she had and her relationship with the SNP, and indeed the impact that it's going to have on a very successful political party in Scotland. So I think it's still got a way to run.
Yeah.
I mean, no idea how it ends, but I think what will be fascinating is what the kind of political picture looks like in Scotland come the next general election.